Hello and welcome to episode number 38 of the Scottish History Podcast. My name is Owen Innes and this week it's a very, very special podcast. A couple of weeks ago I sat down with a real historian. I am not a historian, I'm just a guy who likes history. But a couple of weeks ago I sat down with a real historian and I would like to present that for you this week on episode number 38 of the Scottish History Podcast. So folks, once again, welcome to episode number 38. A couple of weeks ago I had the pleasure of sitting down with historian Dr. Fiona Watson, who has written books such as Under the Hammer, Edward I and Scotland 1296 to 1305, and her more recent book, Traitor, Outlaw, King, about King Robert the Bruce. Nothing really to do with the film, it just came out round about the same time. Those two books are absolutely fantastic if you like your history on the Scottish Wars of Independence. So basically we sat down, I had a few questions, but we kind of just sat down and had a chat about that sort of thing. Now, I know that this particular type of format isn't everyone's favourite type of format, but it was something that when I first started this podcast that I'd always wanted to do. I'd always wanted to get in touch with Fiona, and of course lockdown happened and everything like that, so we finally managed to arrange being able to sit down and have a chat. So I would like to present that for you today. So again, thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope that you enjoy this little interview with Dr. Fiona Watson. Just before the podcast begins as well, folks, I just want to mention there is a couple of little audio issues due to the way in which we had to record the podcast. The beginning sounds okay, but then about sort of 5 minutes or so, 3 or 4 minutes into the podcast, it does kind of get a little bit weird. However, I believe that it is totally clear enough in order to hear. So anyway, I hope that you enjoy this podcast with Dr. Fiona Watson. So thank you very much for agreeing to doing this. Sure. It's and it's about my favourite bit of history as well. I do like the Wars of Independence. That was actually the first, when I started the podcast, they were like the first 5 or 6 episodes that I did. Because I've been trying to keep them to like 20 minutes long.
Yeah.
And so it basically went like Alexander the Second and Third, Wallace, and then like Bruce over like 3, I think it was 3 or 4 episodes, I think it took me to do Bruce. But again, it's all total hobbyist. It's just reading whatever information I could find online.
Oh no, it's brilliant. But I mean, yeah, you could spin this out indefinitely. My PhD supervisor took 3 lectures to do the Great Cause. So you can go anywhere you like.
Jeez.
I know, give me strength.
Well, I've unfortunately not had enough time. I bought both the Under the Hammer and Traitor, Outlaw, King.
Oh yeah. That's
like when we first started talking, and
did you?
I just never. I've managed to get up to chapter 4 on Traitor, Outlaw, King, just because I've just not had the time to sit and read anything. But I went back through it and was browsing through it and stuff like that. So yeah, the Great Cause was.
Well, that's better. I'm glad you did that because I've just revised Under the Hammer, so it's going to be reissued at some point. Because it's 20 odd years old.
Is it?
Well, I mean, they may have printed and put a new date on, but it hasn't been updated.
Right.
Still my ridiculous thanks to various people from 30 years ago.
Yeah, I always so like with King Edward, I always like when you're sort of on a tour as well, you've kind of got to be careful with the things that you say. But one thing that I always used to say was like King Edward was an absolute genius. Like he was just military genius. Like I don't think there's a single Scottish person who like knowledgeable, who's actually even read into anything that happened that would in any way disagree with his utter genius in the way in which he went about things. I mean, the way in which he went about things was maybe not quite the the greatest ways, but it was
unfortunate. Yeah. No.
Aye. So, where to start? I don't even know where to start.
Well, where would you like to start? I mean, we could do this all night, but
that's the thing.
So,
I think
do you want to focus on Bruce or Wallace or
I mean, it's
the outbreak of the wars, whatever.
It's entirely up to yourself. I mean, I'd say I went through. I did manage to pick out a few questions, but they're so all over the place that it's unreal, and it's like. So I suppose it's more. I think this is kind of more for me than for anyone listening to a podcast, because there's like there's certain things that like
absolutely
quite. It's not that I didn't quite understand them. It's just like sort of reading into it. You're like I've got maybe a bit of a conspiracy brain at times. So I think. So one of the biggest questions which I had was about Alexander III. And I think there's and as I say, even in your book, when I was reading sort of through it yesterday, there's no sort of definitive as to what exactly. Well, we know exactly what happened to Alexander III in terms of he died. But what do you think happened?
Definitely died.
But it's like, what do you think actually happened? Because there's a few. I've been to Dunfermline Abbey a few times, and one of the guys that's in there, one of the custodians, he does this brilliant talk about Bruce and stuff like that. But he also alludes to, was Alexander pushed? Do you think that Alexander may have been, was it all sort of a ruse in a way? Well, I mean, I know it was Alexander's choice.
And the other night my husband and I, no, nobody made him go. In fact, they were all going, don't go, don't be stupid. It was dark. It was pitch black. I mean, it was stormy. There's no moon. I mean, you rely on the horse to follow a path, and his horse didn't.
Well, it followed a path, but not the right one.
Yes, straight over the cliff, or not, because yes, it doesn't actually say he went over the cliff, but he was definitely dead at the bottom of it. I honestly don't subscribe to any conspiracies about that, because there's no evidence immediately after that Edward had any interest in Scotland. It takes him a hell of a long time to kind of. He's much busier, with his fallout with Philip IV of France and as Duke of Gascony, which Edward is. He's much more concerned about all of that, and he's genuinely sad. I mean, Alexander's a member of his own extended family as his brother-in-law. So, it's just not something that. I don't think it entered into his head. The relationship between Scotland and England was incredibly stable and incredibly good. And I think for me, I do say this quite often, that's the huge tragedy of the situation. It's not even the stupid death of a king, which was entirely his own fault. It's the fact that there's this unusually good relationship between neighbours that is completely scuppered by what happens next.
Aye. That was always kind of like one of the things that you always get asked about as well is like, England and Scotland have always been fighting, they all hate each other and stuff like that. It's like, well, no, there's probably been periods where we've actually quite liked each other for a lot longer than there has been when we've been kind of fighting with each other and stuff like that. So So
I mean it hadn't been great, but then this is the period where all over Europe neighbours were fighting, big countries were swallowing up. Well, France is gobbling up Normandy, Brittany, all the bits that had been independent. You forget we're independent because they're now still part of France. England and Scotland have been the same, and most of the time it's the Scots that have been the aggressors, trying to take more of Northumberland.
Yeah,
it's always us crossing the border, our swords in our hands.
Yeah, I think we certainly did do that in quite a number of occasions. And the English going,
oh, for goodness sake, well, you just stay over there. So that's why,
like sort of poking the big dog. It's like the big dog will take it for a little while, and then eventually they're like, no, we're not having this anymore. And then it's like, and then you realise why you don't poke the big dog with a stick.
And then you forget instantly. Do it again. That's what we did. I think what I was saying, was that, the relationship between Scotland and England was such that there wasn't really even a border. I mean, we were two distinct kingdoms, but people just came and went, and people were marrying and having family on both sides. I mean, when you look at even this, obviously the top guys, King John was son-in-law of the man who think him at Dunbar, so it's just so interconnected. And you just think how awful it must have been, and how actually you kind of think, well, there must have been a great temptation in many ways for the Scottish aristocracy to just go, well, it wouldn't be all that different for us. And I think that's where Edward really mucked up, is that he made it, he could have taken those guys and said, look, my rule's not going to be hugely different from what went before, but he didn't. He just said, I'm going to do it this way, my way, and anything else, forget it. And they just thought, well, you're giving us no reason to buy into it, because they quite often get slagged off, the Scottish aristocracy, but I think that's unfair. You always have to ask yourself, well, what else could they have done, in the situation in which they found themselves? And most of the time they tried blooming hard to wriggle out of or actively fight against Edward.
Yeah, I think it was, what was very strange is when again, the years and things like that are going to be completely missing. But basically, when Edward called everyone to, was it Upsetlington?
Yeah, the Scots. The Scots. Norham. He was at Norham.
Norham, that's the one. Yeah, that's even in one of my podcasts. I should have listened to my own podcast to get myself refreshed on it. But yeah, it was that seemed very strange when he was just like, right, everybody meet me here, and you've got no choice about it whatsoever. And then he was like, I'm going to choose your new king, and if I don't choose a new king, then it'll be me. You literally have no say in that whatsoever.
I think, or you
can have as much say as I can possibly
give you,
as I want to give you.
That whole thing is very difficult, because the record of it was doctored later. It was doctored in 1296 when Edward took over Scotland. So the record of what happened on each day was moved and changed, because the orders of which things happened is really, really important, and it's been unpicked. And it's really hard to read the stuff that Archie Duncan wrote about it. He's the one who can give you 3 lectures on the Great Cause, which is why, because he was trying to untangle the misinformation that we've been given.
Yeah.
But the Scots were in shock, because they had either kidded themselves or genuinely believed, they knew that they were in an impossible situation, because subjects can't choose kings. It's God that chooses kings. So how do you actually do it? And this is not something particular to Scotland. England had been through it in the previous century, and that had been a bitter, bitter civil war, Stephen and Matilda. The French are going to go through it in the next century, that's going to herald the 100 Years' War. So it's something, biology, when you go to this primogeniture, eldest son down the line, you're going to run out sooner or later, and you're going to have to face this. And so the Scots did it. And in actual fact, the Scots did very well, given that not only did they have to do that, but they also had to fend off this really, really powerful neighbour. But somebody had to do the choosing, and Edward was an obvious choice. He was Scotland's nearest neighbour. He was renowned in Europe as a diplomat, as someone who did try to sort out problems. So he was the person that was going to save Scotland from civil war, and that's what they were worried about the most. They weren't worried about a war with England. That was inconceivable. When you're right, when Edward said, right, everyone to Norham, they went, isn't Norham in England? That's a bit of a problem, because this is a Scottish issue, and you need to come into Scotland and sort it out. which is why the Scots went up Settlington, which is just on the other side of the Tweed, so they could sort of wave and shout. But one lot were in Scotland.
In typical Scottish style as well. It's like, no, we're going to be as stubborn as possible. It's like, you're over there, you're over here. We'll just shout at each other. That's totally fine.
We'll sort it out that way.
We'll sort this out by a shouting match across the Tweed.
Well, unfortunately, Edward is at least as stubborn.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually quite a sort of a good insight on it, because like it was actually fairly peaceful, almost in a way. The whole sort of like that whole in comparison to Civil War and 100 Years' War in France and stuff like that. I never actually quite thought of it that way before.
Yeah, so you have to look and see, well, gosh, this is a very difficult situation, and there were genuine concerns about civil war, because there already had been a little bit of one when the Maid, before the Maid, about letting the Maid of Norway become queen, even though they'd all signed an oath, they'd all sworn that they would accept her as Alexander's heir if he didn't have any other children. But when it came to the bit, of course, Robert Bruce of Annandale, the competitor, said, to hell with that, you want me. I'm the right guy for the job. And there had been civil war, and there are records of it. And there was quite a bit of devastation. So this was a very real fear, and that was always at the back of everyone's minds. And they needed Edward. They needed somebody to sort it out. Because obviously there were two factions.
Yeah.
Bruce and Balliol. So.
Yeah. The Bruce versus Balliol thing always sort of interested me as well. Because so the way in which I always used to put it, and again, this is probably a lot of what I suppose in a way that I would see things as well is kind of almost hindsight. It's like in hindsight, realistically, Balliol was kind of the wrong choice as such, but like it's like that had to happen in order for whatever everything else that happened. If it wasn't for if it wasn't for Alexander the Third, trying to right the Kinghorn, then the whole thing wouldn't have happened.
Damn young wives, honestly. Temptation. The question we have to ask ourselves when it comes to Bruce versus Balliol, is the evidence is pretty clear that Robert Bruce of Annandale would have done anything that Edward said. He was the first to accept Edward as Lord Superior of Scotland, and Balliol was the last, probably because the Common family, who've been written out of history but are so important to this period, the John Comyn of Badenoch and his cousin the Earl of Buchan, they were the ones who really ran Scotland and had ran it during the period after the death of Alexander. They were related. They were brothers-in-law with Balliol. John Comyn of Badenoch was, and they were saying, well, don't do this. But then when Edward made it clear that you couldn't be in the competition to be king unless you accepted him as Lord Superior, then Balliol had no choice. But he was last and Bruce was first. So you have to say to yourself, if Bruce had been made king, he would have done everything that Edward asked anyway, and all we would have done is reversed the position in terms of who was actually on the throne, and probably made it a bit more difficult. But so I honestly don't think it wouldn't have mattered who had been chosen as king. The point was that Edward had it sewn up so that movement, the restrictions that were going to come once the king was inaugurated, would be the same, and it would just be a question of accepting them, and a very fundamentally different relationship between Scotland and England that had compromised fundamentally the independence of Scotland, or fighting for it. And the most important element in that conundrum is war between France and England, because it's only when that starts kicking off, which is around 1294, that Scots suddenly become attractive to France as an ally, and so they've got another big dog this time stroke to have on side against, because they're not suicidal. They were not going to take on England by themselves. In actual fact, that's what they ended up doing, because France was help. But at least they had that psychological kind of, I mean, and in some ways, when you jump in ahead, when you see what the Scots did, because they're the ones that kind of kick off the war in 1296 by invading England, you can kind of think that they're expecting the cavalry to come over the channel any minute, and it just doesn't happen.
Yeah. I think if my sort of memory serves me correctly, with Edward being in France at the time, certainly in sort of 1296, when Edward's down there.
1297 is after the conquest. He goes after. Yeah.
So he's basically in France, and he basically, Edward, the English army, I think, was the largest in the world at that time. So I think he essentially been able to essentially cut his army in half, leave half of them in France, send the other half up to Scotland, and even then the half that he still had left in France, that technically would have been able to stop any sort of French.
Well, it's interesting because there's another complicating factor in all of this, which was that England was really fed up with all the demands, because I mean, Edward has been off and on at war most of his reign, certainly since the 1280s. He's conquered Wales. Yeah, there is trouble in Ireland sometimes, but yeah, major conquest of Wales, which flares up again. Fight with France, and now he's kind of got it kicked off in Scotland. So you take your hat off for multitasking. But and you're right. England does have one of the most impressive armies, certainly the largest. Logistically, it is impressive. It could do with. It needs to change. As warfare is changing in this period, but even Edward can't. There is a limit to it, and the limit is actually on the English people who are just utterly war weary. They have paid and paid and paid, and now they're being asked to pay even more. And when Edward does go to the continent in 1297, so he conquers Scotland in 1296, sets up the government and just says, right, that's it, just get on with it, and expects, and to begin with, this does happen. Scottish taxation will then help the English war effort in France. And as I say, that does happen to begin with, until the Scots went, don't think so. The English army in Flanders, because Edward goes to the Low Countries to fight France, is none of the English earls would go. They're all so fed up with them, and so England is very close to civil war. And it has been a big army in Scotland in 1296, but it's really, you could argue, and it has been argued by Michael Presswich, who wrote biography of Edward I, that Stirling Bridge, Wallace and Murray's great victory, was actually what united the English with their king and allowed Edward to bring up a huge English army, one of the biggest ever, 25,000. Which is not big by modern standards, which was huge by medieval standards, in 1298, which led to Wallace's defeat, of course, at Falkirk.
At Falkirk, yeah. So, just quickly back to the Bruce Balliol thing. So, obviously, Balliol signs the... Why is my mind gone blank?
It's Friday.
Say again, sorry.
It's Friday.
Yeah. Well,
and you've been working...
I've been off my work all week.
Oh, that's right. That'll be it.
This is what's like. I think it's just mentality. Come on.
Give us a clue. Is it a film? Is it a book?
No. It's, so Balliol signs with France.
Oh, the treaty.
The treaty with France. Yeah. What's the bloody name of it though?
Does it have a name? This is the treaty with France. Like the old alliance.
The old alliance, that's the one. Yes, yeah.
I think that's what we call it. I don't think they call it. It's an old alliance. We're signing the old alliance.
Old alliance. I don't think so, no.
I don't think so, no.
So obviously, I think that was quite a big sort of turning point between Balliol and Edward. I think Edward didn't obviously the fact that Balliol did that. And now that makes sense to me, because I never knew the Balliol to be the last to sign for the great cause sort of thing. But do you think? I think it would be then highly unlikely that Robert Bruce would have signed anything along those lines.
not. No, I think you're probably right. It's hard to tell, but the evidence suggests he was totally spineless. He was quite happy about this sub-king status. Sorry, spineless is unfair. He was happy to be. See, maybe
I get what you mean.
He was, yeah. I'll go for it. He was fine. No, he was. He. I think it's us who have this kind of very modern, and which, to be fair, people were starting to think about in 1300 around that time. This issue of sovereignty. There had been big kings and little kings. In British terms, kings of Scots had always admitted, yeah, we're not as big a king as the King of England. He's much more powerful than we are. In Ireland, we have a high king, and you've got lots of other kings. So the kingship was relative for most of this period. And you do have the King of England. Okay, he's the only king in England, but he is also the Duke of Gascony in a subordinate position to the King of France. So all these things are still circling. And Bruce didn't see any contradiction, I suspect, between being the King of Scots beneath the King of England. Why not?
Yeah, no, that's see. I think what a lot of people's misconceptions would be that obviously Balliol was like, he was rubbish. He was the worst king we've ever had. I mean, like you can't even have a Scottish king called John anymore. From that's if I've got that completely right. I don't think it's written into law.
It was written into law.
Well, there we go. Because Robert, because Robert III's name was.
Well,
John,
what gets me about that is why did he name his eldest son John? If he wasn't,
well, there is that.
He had to change it to Robert.
But yeah, no, I've always found that sort of fascinating. But I think kind of as obviously the history kind of goes on, I think there's only ever been one King John of England as well, so I don't think John's not necessarily a name which is going to appear anytime soon.
No, if you're going to be a king, don't be called John. Although interesting, Robert Bruce, I think, because when Prince David was born, he was a twin, and the other one didn't live very long, but I think he was John. I could be wrong about that, but I think so. I might have to look that up.
Yeah.
Yes. John's in Scottish history.
Yeah, I think James is also quite an unlucky name as well. With the ultimate way of how many Jameses died in very strange circumstances, and then obviously what happened to the later 7th and 8th and stuff like that.
Oh yes, yeah. Blowing up by your own cannon, that's got to be the best one.
Yeah, that I think that's one of my favourites.
Although the tennis court story, I was thinking about that, but we digress.
Yeah, I think getting killed, essentially getting killed because of tennis balls, is also quite a good one.
It's good,
he doesn't want to lose his tennis balls. That was quite a good one.
That up.
I've not quite got round to doing all of the Jameses yet on the podcast. I've done the Jacobites and stuff like that.
Oh, have you? You started at the other end.
I just start everywhere. Like I just so because I normally record them once a week, I basically sort of sit for a week, and then on usually a Friday evening, it's just like bang, there's just an idea, and it's just like, right, I'm gonna go down this route, because again, I think it's just sort of more like passion about it, I suppose. I put more effort into an episode where like I really want to learn about that episode this time.
Oh, quite right.
So like I've been going through a few books recently, and I've been doing sort of going back to the beginning kind of thing. So like about the early settlers and and stuff like that. And then I'm up to the Vikings just now. The last episode was sort of the Bronze Age, and then into the Iron Age, and then up to the Romans. But then obviously Monday coming up is St. Andrew's Day, so I can't not do an episode about St. Andrew's Day, so people are going to have to wait for the Romans for a week or a couple of weeks after that until I sort of get around. My plan this week was to basically record as many episodes as I possibly could, but that went incredibly well, and I'm back to work on Sunday night, so I basically got tomorrow to come up with. I'll probably do the Vikings one tomorrow, and then that means I've got 2 episodes ready to go. Then hopefully this one. We've removed the 14 limit. Oh, there you go. So that
what did you do?
nothing. I'm literally just staring at that message. That's good.
They obviously like our stuff.
Yeah. Maybe is the government listening in? I mean, I don't know what government around the world is going to be interested in.
You wish they were interested, but sadly, I suspect they're not.
Yeah. No, I think that's one of the sort of annoying things about, when I was growing up, we did Mary Queen of Scots in primary school, and then we maybe studied the Jacobites for 3 or 4 weeks in between learning about the First and Second World Wars in high school.
Yeah,
that was literally it. And I think
there's more now. My son did. He did higher last year, and the wars was one of the topics. And you can do the wars in advanced higher, the 6th year. But there's a danger that the wars of independence become like the Nazis, where you get them, and that's about all you get. So I mean, I think the problem is that many young people come out of school with no real. I'm going to have to let the dog out. Sorry.
Okay.
With no real sweep of Scottish history, no kind of broad understanding of even what the main stuff going on actually was, and that's more of a worry. I mean, every citizen should know something about the history, just as they know something about the geography and everything else.
Yeah, I think personally, I believe that if there's only 2 stories or 2 parts of Scottish history that everyone should know about, and that's the Wars of Independence and the Jacobite times, because Wars of Independence kind of set up how essentially Scotland became its own nation in a way. I mean, it was its own nation for a long time before then, but that was kind of like with Barnett, Byrne, etc. The Declaration of Arbroath, which of course then likely influenced the Declaration of Independence in America as well. And possibly the Treaty of Versailles. I think I read somewhere along. It was probably talking utter nonsense, but just sort of like leave us alone kind of thing.
I'm sure
maybe not the Treaty of Versailles, but there was probably another one.
Yeah.
But I think everyone should know about that and the Jacobites, because the Jacobites. And like the end moving forward kind of tells you why Scotland is the way that it is now, because that's still fairly recent history in comparison.
Oh, it is. But you're such a romantic. I mean, there's so much more. I mean, that's high politics. Which, to be honest, a lot of the time doesn't impact on people's lives at all. There's the whole the way that people lived, the differences. The growing difference between Highlands and Lowlands. What languages, there's just a million and one ways you can dice this, and as far as school's concerned, the easiest way and the best way to get kids interested is to start local. What was happening in your neighbourhood, in your neck of the woods, over the sweep of Scottish history, and then how does that fit in to the broader sweep of Scottish history, the national history, and then how does that fit in a wee bit to European and global history, obviously, as we go into the modern period. But why did so many people not support the Jacobites? The urban and growing urban rural divide. Something that's very relevant to today. All the great scientific and intellectual things that went on, as well as the Reformation, which was probably I lose interest as a historian simply because then you do have to think about whether somebody was Protestant or Catholic, whereas before then you don't have to worry about it. But that's a huge, apart from anything else, that transformed the relationship between Scotland and England, because Scotland became Protestant along with England, and then you're against France, which remains Catholic. So you've got, you can, as I say, you can dice the problems. I've sat on a committee once which was talking about history in schools, and the issue that we have, unlike science, in science you need to know certain things before you can go on and learn other things. There are building blocks and you advance. Every historian will tell you a million, in fact, every Scottish person will tell you different sections of Scottish history that everyone has to know. So that's the problem. But as I say, if you actually say, look, I'm sitting in Braco, in Perthshire. We have a Roman fort, but we were. The village itself was only constructed in 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and yet there's been castles here for much, much earlier. And in fact, I've got records. I didn't live here at the time of the earldom of Strathearn, with many of the place names that are just on our doorstep, all there. And that's really fascinating. So for me, it's not really a question of you must know X, Y, and Z. I would like kids to have a long, just some idea of every century, what's the key elements, whether that's agricultural reform, Reformation, rival of the Romans, or something like that. But more importantly, what was going on in my backyard? Because then it's personal, and it is your history, and it is every individual's history. It's just that if you want to be a citizen in a modern democracy, I think you do have to have some kind of understanding of what happened beforehand to bring you to this point. It shouldn't define the decisions you make now, but it certainly is part of it. That's my political performance over for the day.
I'll send that in an email to. No, that's. I think that's. I think you're utterly correct there.
Oh, thank you.
Like, I love hearing. See, I live in Bonnyrigg, just outside of Edinburgh, and obviously around about here it's all like sort of coal mining and stuff like that, But again, see, I'm a history sort of guy. I think it would be different if, if you weren't, that would kind of get you into, it's like, oh, there's a place 5 minutes walk away from your house where you can go after school. Have a look around it, and this is what it used to be, and these are the people that used to live there, and they came from such and such. I think that's actually a very good.
Yeah, because you're right. I mean, if you're interested in history, you won't mind. You'll be reading about it anyway. But if you're not, and most people probably aren't, that will excite you because you can see it, you can feel it, you can understand it. I mean, our village was 5 years ago. And there was a lot of that stuff going on, and there's various people brought a lot of the history together, and people were fascinated and going, oh gosh, that's my house, and so lived there, and that was really nice.
Yeah. Oh, pardon me. Right.
Where are we?
So I think maybe a wee bit about Wallace would be quite good.
Oh, Wallace.
Yeah. What's your overall opinion of Wallace?
He's really difficult because, on the one hand, he's the one everybody wants to talk about, and quite rightly. And he's
Bruce is cooler, though.
There's more to say about him. I mean, we know more about him. He lasted a bit longer. I mean, Wallace is exceptional. I mean, he's unbelievable in the sense that most nations have someone like this, but half the time they're mythical. And in a way, Wallace is mythical, but he actually did exist, and we have documents and we have things to prove it. The problem is that all the things you do want to know about him, the documents won't really tell you, and people think they know him from the stories that grew up about him, and most of those stories were an amalgam of stories from the wars that were told, that get wrapped up into the Superman, William Wallace, and The Wallace, which is the book that was produced in 150 years after his death in the 15th century. That is so powerful because it formed the basis of Braveheart. But you can show that actually that had nothing to do with Wallace. That event was some completely different place, completely different folk, completely different time, probably in the time of Bruce. So he is a problem. I mean, at the same time, I have a feeling, because when I was writing the book about Bruce, ironically, and somebody else said this, that I got to read it, Wallace actually comes out a little bit more clearly because you're looking at Wallace from a distance. He's doing stuff, but my focus was on Bruce. And the impression you get about Wallace is he really, really didn't care about noble politics. He really couldn't care less. In fact, he almost certainly thought it was a complete waste of time. So, you get the point in 1299 where you've got two guardians, because Wallace himself, of course, had to give up after Falkirk. So you've got John Comyn of Badenoch, the son of his father's still alive, but incapacitated.
Yeah.
So that's nephew of King John, and Robert Bruce, the younger, the grandson of the competitor, the future king. And that is basically the two political factions in Scotland. It's the Comyn faction that are far, far more powerful. And young Bruce is only there because he managed to step in when the Commons were out the way in the immediate aftermath of the conquest. So he's kind of keeping the family's flame alive, if you like, in Scotland. But very quickly he's shunted out the way because he just isn't politically powerful enough. So, they're having argy-bargy. There's seizing one of the other and punch-ups and Peebles, which probably happens every other day, but I don't know Peebles. That is not true. Peebles is a very nice place. So that's all going on. And they're arguing over Wallace because Wallace is planning to go to the continent, and John Comyn, or at least one of his men, accuses Malcolm Wallace, William's brother, who's in the retinue of the Earl of Carrick, the future king, that Wallace is going away to the continent that he shouldn't be doing this. It's treachery, lese majesty, and all this, which is probably the Commons suspecting that William Wallace is going to the continent to argue for a Bruce king. That's probably what they're worried about. I don't think William had any intention of that. He goes to visit John Balliol, and we know that because when he's captured in 1305, he has a safe conduct from John Balliol with him, and there's no other point at which he could have got that other than when he went to the continent around 1299, 1300. So he visited Balliol, who had been released from English custody by that time.
He was in France at the time, wasn't he?
He is in France, initially in papal custody. I know that doesn't slightly make sense, but the Pope has some nice estates in France, as you do.
Yeah.
Not jealous.
Balliol did like the finer things in life as well.
Well, he wasn't left with much. Well. He was desperate to get his English lands back. Absolutely desperate. Yeah. He'd lost almost everything. I mean, he must have gone, sorry, remind me why I went in for that contest again. That was really stupid. I mean, he really was reduced to what his family had started with, and they'd gathered. I mean, his father, John Balliol, was the richest man in England. The king, Henry III, was desperately jealous of him, and so, he had lost. We forget about that. He had lost pretty much everything in this escapade. So Wallace, anyway, back to Wallace. So as I say, the nobles John Comyn may have thought that Wallace took a side. Wallace himself did not. Wallace himself, I think, knew perfectly well that opening the whole issue of the kingship was tantamount to just handing Scotland over to Edward I, because you haven't got time and energy for that nonsense. Balliol had been inaugurated as king. Balliol was the king, and it was a question of getting him back, and that's what Wallace did, even though his brother, as I say, was in the retinue of the Earl of Carrick. So I think he just got on with it. He did what needed to be done as far as he saw it, and ignored everything else. And I think that's pretty modern, if you see what I mean. Not all the politicking goes on now, and people are always taking sides. But we'd like to think that kind of more abstract love of country, that everything else that noble politics is dominated by, which is very much about personal relationships, and we can't blame them for that. That's what their society was about. They swore homage and fealty to a man, not to an abstract concept of an independent Scotland. It was very hard for them to think like that. Pope was telling them that wasn't a very good thing for them to be thinking. So, they had a difficulty in seeing beyond individuals. Wallace, as probably someone who was in the sort of middling sort, so he's not a peasant, but he's the younger son of a small landowner. He did seem to be able to cut to the chase in terms of, I'm fighting for Scottish independence, and I don't really care about most of the other things that go with that if you're a nobleman. It is remarkable that he came from almost nowhere. He really came from nowhere, with Andrew Murray, whom we do tend to forget. And then
I've always thought that Andrew Murray was very unfairly forgotten.
Yes,
because I think even at even with the battle at Stirling Bridge, I think Murray was the guy who was in charge. It's essentially, if you wanted to kind of put a hierarchy on it, I suppose. I think I always get this impression that Murray was actually sort of the leader of it at that point. Wallace was kind of like number two, almost.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose. I'd love to have been, in the camp, the Scottish camp, the night before the battle. I mean, these are two young men who both individually engaged in guerrilla tactics. In Andrew Murray's case, he was captured at Dunbar and escaped from prison and came back to his father. His father's still in the Tower of London, and came back and raised his own family's estate, the men of that estate. Wallace must have had a small group of men to begin with, and I think a lot of the Scottish nobility collaborated with Wallace. Wallace was the front, if you like, for Free Scotland, because the Scottish nobility were being watched by Edward I and couldn't, after the defeat at Dunbar, couldn't do anything without repercussions. So they probably sent their men on the quiet to Wallace to train in Selkirk Forest. So both of them had some success. They did find it difficult to take castles without siege equipment, and but they used the terrain and what have you. So yeah, they came together, and there must have been, I don't know, monks or some people going around communicate. I mean, Andrew Murray and William Wallace came together in some way. They must have known they were each of the existence of the other and said, "I'll meet you there, and I'll go down to meet." You see, you have to think about people, messengers crisscrossing the country, spreading the word, and the nobility certainly helped with that. So they came together. How did they organise themselves? Did they argue about strategy? Did they? I mean, obviously Andrew Murray is of a superior rank to Wallace, but how did it work? I mean, it's Wallace who's named in the English chroniclers when it comes to Stirling Bridge, but I think that's just because Andrew Murray, of course, dies pretty much just after the battle, certainly from wounds, isn't in any position to lead after the actual battle. So it's unfortunate that we don't now know what would have happened. I mean, I think it was a real constitutional crisis after Stirling Bridge for the Scots without Murray, because that would, you could see there would have been joint guardianship, and it's really rare to have a single guardian. Very, very rare in Scottish history. So the two of them would have made some sense and would have made Wallace palatable. But of course, Murray dies.
Yeah, I think Murray was a bit more of a kind of a landowner, and in a way, so he was. Oh, yeah. He had more money, more in the ways of actual men and stuff like that. Whereas I think you kind of get the impression that Wallace just kind of picks people out.
Yes,
or like I'm kind of wandering around, and someone finds him and he's like,
"Do you fancy?
I'll come along for the ride. Why not?"
But I do think that men were being sent to him, because the Scottish noblemen couldn't come out themselves. I mean, they'd just been defeated. I mean, some of them did. Obviously, Robert Bruce did with Robert Wishart and James the Steward, and they would have had their own men, but then they submitted. And the Commons were sent. They were sort of on gardening leave in England, or some of them were in prison, and they were sent back to deal with Murray. And they're so funny. They say, "Oh, we're really sorry, but Andrew, we couldn't do anything about it because Andrew Murray, he disappeared into a bog, and our horses couldn't follow them there." And you think, well, these are the Commons who were sent by Queens of Scots in previous generations to do exactly that, to bring the North, or parts of the North, into more strict royal control, and they never had any problems with bogs and horses. So they're just completely going, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but we couldn't manage to do that." They're just being pathetic. And then of course they do show their true colours. The English weren't fooled. I mean, they really knew that most of the Scots were not convinced at all that anything had changed.
Right. Do you think, or is there any evidence anywhere to say that Bruce and Wallace ever had any form of a relationship? I think there's a few probably quite badly written sources to say that, for example, that Bruce might have been at Falkirk, for example.
Bruce wasn't at Falkirk. His father almost certainly was.
No.
That doesn't count, does it? No, Bruce wasn't. Young Bruce wasn't at Falkirk.
No, in a way, technically, it does. It does, because you would then sort of believe that Bruce's father would have been on the side of Edward, which then
he was.
Would make sense as to why there will be that sort of misconception. People just read Robert Bruce on the side of Edward, and therefore, okay, that must have been Robert the Bruce.
Yes, it's a shame they were all the same damn name. It would be helpful if they could have named their children.
Tries to make it really easy to kind of follow it, and even then, I'm like, oh, which one's this again?
You have to give them a number. I end up just giving them a number.
Yeah.
Number 7 is the king. Even Geoffrey Barrow gets that wrong. He calls him Bruce 8 at one point. It's like, no, is he? Actually, I'm getting anyway. No, Bruce wasn't the king. The future king was not at Falkirk. His father almost certainly was, because his father consistently sided with Edward I, while still maintaining the family's right to the throne, which might seem a contradiction, except you have to keep remembering that the Bruce version of Scottish kingship was a sub-kingship to the English king. So he was there. The young Robert had rebelled earlier in 1297 and submitted, but he was supposed to hand over his daughter Marjorie, who's tiny. She's only a toddler, and he never did. And there are big question marks over exactly how loyal he was, and he keeps getting told to come and swear homage and fealty again, and he doesn't. So he's kind of sitting out for this period. He's not at Stirling Bridge, and he's not at Falkirk, but immediately after Falkirk he burns Ayr, and this is him coming back into the political arena. And he must burn Ayr because he knows that Wallace's spell as guardian is over. So who's going to be next? And of course it's him that's next.
Mr. Common.
And it's not often that people go from the winning side to the losing side.
Yeah, again, I think from what a lot of what I kind of read about Bruce beforehand is that he was almost kind of quite selfish in a way, or the way in which he's portrayed was to basically what we would, I suppose, nowadays call follow the money. Basically, whoever's got the most money, whoever's got the most land, I'll follow you, and then we can kind of mooch off each other until.
And I think we have to recognise the driving force behind the actions of the nobility, including kings. Their absolute imperative, this is their duty, is to acquire more, whether that's territory or money or whatever. The Alexanders did it. They wanted the Western Isles. Scots, they wanted more of Northumberland. That's what they do. That's what keeps the men happy. And you can then distribute largesse among your followers, and people say that that's a good thing. So what Edward's doing, he sees an opportunity to acquire Scotland. He would be foolish of him not to take it. And that's what Bruce is doing. Bruce believes that his family should be the kings of Scots, and he's not going to stop. Bruce is utterly consistent. Yes, he swapped sides. He swapped sides in order to keep that goal of the kingship in play. That's what he does. He's very good at it as well. His father is just kind of, well, I'll just sit and wait, and I'm sure Edward will give it to me one day. Whereas Bruce is going, no, I'm not waiting.
Am I right in saying that? So obviously, I know that Robert Bruce was friends with Edward in a way. Did they not fight together in the did they not go on crusade together or something?
Went on crusade. No, hang on a minute.
The grandfather.
I'm trying to remember which one was. I think it was the grandfather who went, and the middle one was going to go but get told to stay, and that's when they managed to secure Carrick.
Right.
Because it's quite a good story. In Acre, en route to the Holy Land, this guy Adam of Canucker, as they do say it in Fife, it looks like Kilconquer.
Yep.
He dies.
I've been there a few times.
You've been playing the golf, have you?
No, I used to be a chauffeur, so I used to I've been all over like the most random places in Perthshire, Aberdeenshire, everywhere.
Yeah, slightly random around here. Anyway, he dies out in crusade, and Brucey, the competitor, knows this and immediately sends back to Junior, his son, and says, because Adam of Canucker was married to Marjorie of Carrick, so there's an earldom going a begging, and the Bruces, of course, don't have one, and so then there's that stupid romantic story about how the younger Bruce, the middle one, was hunting or cavorting in some fashion near Lady Marjorie's castle, and she looked out and she just fell instantly in love with him and went and sort of brought him into her castle, and that was that. All utter nonsense, because of course that led to the birth of the future king. No, it was a real estate deal. They did it, and Alexander was really annoyed with them because they hadn't asked. Earldoms are not just for nobles to arrange amongst themselves; it's the king to give that. So he basically told them to pay a large amount of money, and it was fine. So that's how usually that happened. Yes, large amount of money. I'll feel better.
Sounds about right. So. I had a good line after that, but it's totally can't have been that good.
That happens to me all the time.
I used to do that when I was on tour all the time. I'd used to be like sort of like halfway through something and then be like, what was I actually talking about 3 hours ago that spurred this whole thing? So yeah, I think the film. I mean, I like films, documentaries, and stuff like that. I think the film Outlaw King. I thought it was pretty good. Like as a piece of entertainment. I mean, certainly
what it is.
When you've got sort of like and in terms of like historical accuracy as well, I think you've got kind of Braveheart is way below the scale. And then obviously kind of I think they did pretty well with it, but was the sort of the portrayal of Bruce was that kind of fair in that film, or is it just?
I mean, I think most filmmakers' view of historical accuracy is that they get the armor and the weaponry right. The politics and the personalities. Forget
it. Braveheart didn't even manage to get that.
No, that's true. That's true. Indeed. But I mean, that's the real problem I have is why not have Bruce as he was, which is an utterly ruthless, ambitious man. I mean, Chris Pine did his best, but it was almost like, oh yes, I think it would be right if I became king. For God's sake, you've just spent the previous 10 years struggling for this moment, and I mean, why not have? I mean, I always more recently I've been saying this. I mean, Robert Bruce was Macbeth. His vaulting ambition was so evident from the word go. The minute he's quite young. Well, he's not young by Middle Ages standards, but by now, he is. How old is he when Scotland gets taken over?
Well, he's nearly 30. Is he 54, 55 when he dies? So that's 1329.
He's born in 74. Maths is not my strong point. So,
neither is it mine.
He's only 22 at the conquest. That's right, 1296. Yeah, he's only 22. So he's still quite young. and it's also permanent. And one of the things that I think I did discover in the Outlaw King book was that, sorry, this has nothing to do with the film, was that it looks as if the Bruces lost all their lands in Scotland during the reign of John Balliol, which hasn't generally been accepted. It's quite clear that there's the shenanigans that the Bruces, because there is no end to what they will do, especially Bruce the competitor. If there's a wheeze that he can think of, he will apply it. And what he does after he knows that Balliol's become king is this strange thing of land and title. So he keeps the Lordship of Annandale, which is the core Bruce estates in Scotland. His son is Earl of Carrick, but he hands over Carrick, the earldom, to his son, the future king. So the one in the middle has no lands in Scotland. He has the claim to the throne. And that's so that he doesn't have to swear homage and fealty to Balliol and can therefore legitimately pursue that claim to the throne. Because once you've done that swearing, you shouldn't do that sort of thing. So that's what happens. And so, of course, everyone does have to swear homage and fealty to Balliol. And noticeably, Robert Bruce, the Earl of Carrick, the middle one, hasn't. So there's a summons put out. And it's the youngest one, who goes to the Parliament and says, really sorry, my dad's passed on Carrick to me. And John Balliol, probably with the Commons whispering behind them, go, sorry, well, could you show us the document that says that this transfer has taken place? And anyway, it's not again, because remember, the earldom of Carrick was only by right of Countess Marjorie. It wasn't Bruce's. It's King's gift to ascertain, to decide what happens to these earldoms. So basically, the Carrick gets taken off. They say, right, well, it'll be handed over to royal officials until you can show. And basically, I really want the middle Bruce to come and talk to me about this and possibly. Yeah. So that's all happened. There's no evidence that ever happened, that they came back. And Bruce, the competitor, Annandale, he must have done homage and fealty, because he doesn't lose. He's not summoned and he doesn't lose Annandale. But when he dies in 1295, the Bruces would have ended up with nothing. And it's quite clear that they are severely indebted, because they can't access the revenues of their Scottish estates. They're just dependent on what they have in England, which are rich manors, but nonetheless. So, you can, that also is a sort of seminal aspect of the upbringing of the future king, that he had this great aspiration. The family felt they should have been kings, and yet they're reduced to not having their great inheritance in Scotland. And it is an important inheritance in Scotland. So that's very formative as well. And so the problem I have with the film, any of the films, is that he always comes out pathetic. He always comes out with, oh, what's happening? I've been wronged. Scotland has been wronged. I will be the one to right it. And I mean, that's absolute nonsense. I mean, Bruce was ultimately what Scotland needed. He turned into a military leader of genius. And I think that aspect is he's not given enough credit for that. Just all the different things that he did to really create an army out of nothing that could beat the greatest army in Europe, and keep beating it. And I mean, Edward II had no response to Bruce militarily, and okay, they went too far in Ireland, but it was a phenomenal achievement on Bruce's part to decide not to fight for a start, to get rid of castles. I mean, that's an incredible policy, because they're far more used to the English than they were to the Scots. So all of this, I mean, he basically sat down on any given day and said, okay, what's the best thing to do today facing this? And unfortunately, what subsequent Scottish leaders did was, what did Bruce do with Byrne again? Oh yeah, let's just do that, no matter what we're facing, whether it's guns or whatever. I mean, it's just like, oh God, you really haven't learned that lesson. So he was absolutely incredible as a military leader, and obviously that's what Scotland needed. But he also inflicted incredible hardship on other Scots, because that was a civil war, and we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that he's waging a civil war as much as a national war.
Yeah, I think was that for like about 2 years following the murder of Comyn? Is that?
Well, you could argue that he was fighting it all his life. In that, yes, you're right. Actively, I mean, the big mistake Edward II made was not to come back to Scotland immediately, because that gave Bruce time to tackle the Commons in their heartland, which was across the north, basically. I mean, they have lands everywhere, but Buchan, Badenoch, Lochaber, so that swayed up the Great Glen and across towards Aberdeenshire, is all the heartland of common territory. And I mean, the heirship of Buchan basically meant the fire and sword. People were killed, their possessions, their houses, everything destroyed. That was Scots against Scots. And Bruce he ordered that, which is every bit as bad as anything that Edward I did. So, he did that because he knew he had to be, and that basically sent a whole trail of refugees. And that's, again, another aspect of war we don't talk about. The refugees who were against Bruce, for good reason, because of the murder of John Comyn. They all had to go off to England. But they're still fighting. They're still fighting against Bruce. They're particularly fighting in the Western Isles. The MacDougals over there, again, brother-in-law to Balliol. So that's all still happening. And, of course, many of them, John Comyn's son dies at Bannockburn. Now, we're trained to see that as, well, what did he expect? He's on the wrong side. But the man killed his father. I'm sorry, which side would you be on?
You wouldn't be standing next to him on his right-hand side going, let's give it to them,
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely.
So, and then all the people who thought that Bruce was a murdering usurper with good reason, all of them were forced as a result of Bannockburn to accept Bruce as king, because they said they would be permanently forfeited. So they did accept him, but their hearts weren't in it. And then in 1320, there's a plot to assassinate Bruce, because Edward Balliol, John Balliol's son, was, at liberty to. They thought he was the rightful king, and they were right by many, by the strict rule of law, he was the rightful king. But too much water had flowed under the bridge, to make, because with an Edward Balliol kingship came Edward II as well. So that wasn't acceptable. So, you've got some, I think this is what really annoys me about the films, because it feeds into to my mind something that's just too simplistic. If we think that most of these decisions were easy, I think we fail to understand. Just as in modern politics, sometimes choices are not easy, and they can pit family against family, and we've seen this. And this sort of blanket assumption that my way is the right way and your way is the wrong way, it applies in the past too. Families were split apart, and people who had fought long and hard for Scottish independence in the first phase had no choice but to side against Bruce, which meant, unfortunately, they therefore had to side for Edward II. Didn't want to do that. It's Bruce that had made them do that. And that's the difficulty. And people nowadays judge decent folk in the past for doing what their consciences told them to do. Some of them would be doing it for nefarious reasons, I'm sure. But let's think about what Bruce was doing and why he was doing it. And he wasn't necessarily really doing it for Scotland. It just happened that Scotland's interests and his collided.
Yeah. So I think another sort of big one is, did Bruce go to Greyfriars to kill Comyn, or just to have a conversation?
Just have a wee chat.
And I think there's another thing to say as well, that it wasn't actually Bruce that dealt the final blow. I mean, I think in all intents and purposes, it doesn't really matter. But was it not like a Farquharson or something like that?
Kirkpatrick went to Massacre. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Or so says the Bruce propaganda.
Well, yeah. So that's why, like, when you sort of look back into history and stuff like that, it's always fun. I would rather know the absolute truth, but it's like it is also quite fun playing around with the kind of stories.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, did Bruce go to eliminate Comyn on that day, or was that just an unfortunate incident?
Now, there are many historians wouldn't agree with me, so this is my opinion, but it is through looking at what happened in the lead up to that fateful February day. I believe he went there to kill him. Because now the reason why I think this, bear with me.
I'm bearing.
You're bearing up. Okay, yeah. So let's go back to 1304 and the siege of Stirling. Stirling, of course, is the last Scottish-held castle in the reconquest of Scotland that Edward achieves in that year, in 1304. Remembering that Robert Bruce, the future king, had already submitted 2 years earlier. John Comyn remains guardian. He's pretty much sole guardian for the last few years. And he's the one that negotiates with the English for the rest of the Scots to submit around New Year 1304. As Edward, because he went over the Forth for the first time into what had been free Scotland. Okay, so it's a big law and order exercise to the Scots and the English do together. Well, they don't have anything to do. It's the engineers who are throwing things at Stirling Castle. So they're all shimmying around. Robert Bruce is there, and he hears of the death of his father in April, early April. Within a day or so, he has made an agreement with William Lamberton, the Bishop of St Andrews, of some unspecified relationship, that enterprise that they might undertake, failing which a very large sum would be paid by the defaulter, and there's no mention of their loyalty to King Edward. Now, some people say that, that's just, they haven't, Bruce needed Lamberton's very important. No, Bruce is the one in the ascendancy at this point. He's the one that's been at King Edward's peace. He's the one who's sent, along with other nobles, to round up Wallace and Simon Fraser, all those Scots who hadn't yet submitted. So he's the king's man. He's Sheriff of Ayr, he's Sheriff of Lanark for Edward I. He's the main man in Scotland at this point. So to my mind, that unspecified enterprise is the throne of Scotland. I can't prove that, but it seems highly likely, because the sums involved for defaulting are so huge. There's no obvious reason why Bruce would need Lamberton's support for anything other than the Crown of Scotland. Why would they do that? Anyway, that's all successful. And then Edward turns his mind to the settlement of Scotland. How exactly is Scotland going to be run? He's not very well at this point, Edward. Everybody knows this. That's also important. So in 1305, there's 3 Scots: Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, Robert Wishart, Bishop of Glasgow, who is a pro-Bruce supporter, and John Mowbray, who is pro-Comyn. He's very close to John Comyn of Badenoch. Obviously, Comyn of Badenoch, having led the Scots, isn't allowed back in yet, but he does have a representative, because Edward realises how important the Comyns are. So these 3 men are in London, and they're sent back to Scotland to organise an assembly of Scots, to choose from among them a number of representatives to go to a parliament in London. It would have been in Scotland, but Edward is not well enough to come back. And they're going to help to decide how Scotland's going to be governed. So this is Edward being magnanimous and accepting that he may be mucked up in the first instance and excluding the Scots. So anyway, these 3 go back up to Scotland. And that's when I think Robert Bruce goes, oh dear. Possibly not in those words. Oh dear. He's been out of Scottish politics since 1300, 1301. This is now 1305. John Comyn has led the Scots. John Comyn, don't forget, is nephew of King John. He is King John's nearest relative still in Scotland. Edward Bailey was in prison in England. John himself is in France. There's a genealogy put out through St Andrews about how illustrious and royal John Comyn is. John Comyn and his supporters are almost all the nominees to the Parliament in London for the settlement of Scotland. Bruce is not one. Robert Wishart is not one. So they're all almost all, not all, but they're pro-Comyn guys. So Bruce realises that his political star is on the wane in Scotland. And Edward, he knows, or it's made very clear, Edward acquiesces with this because Edward knows he cannot really run Scotland without the Commons. That's been proved in the previous period. So he goes, well, you know, I don't really need Bruce, actually. Bruce is I think what happens here is that Bruce realizes Edward doesn't have long to go. Once he's gone, all the Scots can choose who they give their oaths of loyalty to. And he is also probably persuaded that John Comyn of Badenoch will take the throne. And that for me explains something that I've always found very difficult about that day in Greyfriars. Why did he not wait? Because if he'd waited till Edward was dead, then he could have made the bid for the throne, and you wouldn't have had all this kind of this real difficulty with people having to choose who they've already sworn homage and fealty to Edward. They're not going to break that oath. Why did he not wait? And it's because if he'd waited, John Comyn would have become king. So that's why he had to take a preemptive action. And that's what he did at Greyfriars. He knew he had to take him out. He knew that he was going to have the Commons come down on him like a ton of bricks because they are so powerful. And there is a suggestion that Bruce had actually sent word to Edward, probably saying, okay, look, I'll do you a deal. I will become king under you, and you protect me from the Commons. Because Bruce had no choice. The only thing he could do was become king. Otherwise, because he had no authority to bring out armies. You know, he was a dead man. So I think what he did was say to Edward, right, you're the only one that can protect me from the Commons, really. But I'm going to be king. So whether you like it or not, he probably calculated that given how ill Edward was, he's not going to want to start the war again. He only just settled it. It was settled in September 1305. This is February 1306. You know, so he probably thought, well, maybe that's a deal that Edward might accept. But of course, Edward is not. He doesn't care how ill he is. He's going to drag his carcass back up to Scotland if need be. So it's a miscalculation and a profound calculation on Bruce's part, because he knows he will miss his opportunity. He knows he's a political has-been. He realizes that the Commons have it all sewn up, and if he doesn't move now, he never. It's game over, completely game over. So to my mind, it doesn't make sense. I mean, what would they talk about? Why would they meet? Some people have said, oh, it's about something to do with a land dispute. I'm sorry. No, they were not talking about land disputes. They were talking about the only thing that was really in people's minds, given how ill Edward was, what happens next?
Yeah. So even thinking that of where Greyfriars is as well, like that's a long way away from Common Country.
Well, no, because he has Dalswinton, which is just up the road, and that's where Bruce takes Dalswinton. That's where John Comyn was. He would be at Dalswinton. So immediately Bruce takes Dalswinton and Tibbers because Sir Richard Seward he's the sheriff of Dumfries and he's pro-Common. He's a Common man. No, the Commons have tentacles everywhere. So although their main lands and wealth are in the north, they that's not a problem for them.
So obviously your book about Bruce is called Traitor, Outlaw, King.
I can't think why. Sorry.
I think
have to earn a living.
I think there was quite a few. Again, I do remember reading a few like news articles and stuff like that. I think there was a few revelations that I think that even the Scottish press didn't quite get along with. I think the main one was.
But that is not news. That is so
I know. I know,
I'm not the first to say it.
It brought it to my attention. I think
it's what the journalist. The journalist read the book, and I was trying to push the business about Bruce being fostered into a Gaelic-speaking family. I was trying to push this business about them losing their land. No, the thing he went for was that he was probably born in Essex. I was big in Essex. So I'm sorry. I just said what I think a lot of historians assume is probably almost certainly true, which has been known in Essex for a long time. In fact, I think there's even a plaque down there. So it's just that, yes, that's the thing that everybody goes for. He's an Essex boy.
Well, if anyone is thinking that's a problem, I mean, I don't see there being a problem with that because, you know, I mean, ultimately, what did he do for Scotland? What did he do for England, and what did he do for Scotland? So I think that, again, on the scales, I think Scotland kind of won on that one. And I mean, even the chances, even if he was born down there, he spent most of his life up here anyway.
Oh, what does it matter? I mean, I was born in Edinburgh, but I don't let that hold me back.
I was born in Livingston, so.
Oh, were you? Well, anybody else wants to write in and tell us where they were born?
I think Bangor was actually listed as Broxburn. I think my passport says I was born in Broxburn, but it's actually closer to Uphall than it is to Broxburn. Yeah. Actually closer to Bathgate than it is to Broxburn. Yeah. I think. Well, yeah, I used to. My dad used to take me up the Bathgate Hills quite a lot. When me and my brother were younger, we used to go to, is there Wallace Hill?
Oh, right.
Where apparently, I don't know whether this is complete and utter nonsense or not. It probably is. There's like a hill, and it's got like this kind of nice divot out the side of it, and apparently Wallace hid in that hill from
on down, yes, in that hole.
After Falkirk. Which, I mean, it would make sense because the Bathgate Hills aren't that far away from.
Yeah, Falkirk. But that's going the wrong way, isn't it? I mean, you wouldn't be going towards where the English would be, would you? I'm missing quite the other way.
Exactly. So for a revelation on it's my dad's 60th birthday today as well. So
happy birthday.
A nice wee revelation for him would be, you told me a load of lies when I was a kid.
But that's their job.
I think another sort of Brucey story, which is I think it's pretty much guaranteed that it was made up, would be Walter Scott's spider story. I think I remember my dad telling me that story when I was about 5.
How have we? Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry.
I think my dad told me that story when I was about 5 or something like that. What was it that made you sort of like really kind of focus on that sort of period of history, the sort of the medieval period of history? And like, I'd say for me, I'm in my 30s now. I think it's a bit too late for me to go back to university I don't even think I would get into university.
Oh, I know.
Trust me, I tried back when I was a lot younger.
I think you'd be absolutely fine. I grew up in Dunfermline, so Bruce is there.
To me, that makes a lot of sense.
I don't know. When I was young, I was very romantic about my history, and I love Mary Queen of Scots. I read up everything about her, and Bruce. It was the romance of Scottish history. The sort of great personalities that suffered and endured terrible things and were done down or what have you, all of that kind of negative aspects of Scottish history, which good stories. They're really good stories. And I didn't get Scottish history at school. I got one. We did one history teacher in second year at high school. Did talk to us about the Wars of Independence, which makes sense given that we are in Dunfermline. We got mostly English history, even when we were doing British history. That old chestnut, and we got a wee bit about Mary Queen of Scots, but it was all through reading myself, mostly reading myself. I get taken to Barnett when I was in primary school, and that was important. So I was, I just kind of really loved the stories and the romance of it. And I did medieval history at St Andrews because I don't like modern history. I'm really sorry. I like the detective work of the earlier period where you've got to kind of take disparate pieces of information. Totally frustrating a lot of the time because you don't have what you want. whereas the modern period, you're sifting through so much and you kind of get through it all. That for me, I don't like that. I like the detective work, and that's just me. So I enjoyed my medieval history. I did my PhD, and I really enjoyed that. My supervisor Archie Duncan was just fantastic, and it was a real privilege to have that time to just devote to research. And then you kind of you do get older and more cynical about motivation and well, I don't know, you just then end up with the complexity of it all, and there's no simple answers, no rights and wrongs. Well, there are rights and wrongs, but a lot of it isn't it's not what you thought it was when you were younger, which is annoying, because that's the way it goes. The weird, the Scots didn't always come out.
Is it annoying though when like it's like the story which you thought was like, oh, this is not even a story. I mean, like you just sort of, this is amazing, and then it's like, oh no, wait a minute, like now we've got more evidence to say that it wasn't quite as exciting.
No, but it always is. I always think it's more exciting because it's more complicated. And the more complicated it is for me now, the more interesting it is. When it's just a straight black and white, that's not interesting to me.
If it's straight black and white, then everyone tells the same story.
Yeah, exactly so. And
then that sort of period of history, you could literally just kind of close the book on it. It's like it's like even with, so like if you go back to, I know exactly what you were saying about sort of the modern history. So even just kind of like, just again choosing the Jacobites as an example, there was writings everywhere. There was newspaper articles. There was books written at the time. There was, the stories were all sort of passed down. I mean, there's even a website out there that can tell you exactly where Bonnie Prince Charlie was every single day after the Battle of Culloden. Tell you exactly what, probably even down to what he was wearing. What colour of socks
for his tea.
Wearing, and what he had for his tea. When was the last time he went for a swim? that sort of thing. Whereas what I like most about the medieval history is like, and I always have sort of like the bit when you reach that sort of period and it's like the answer to this question we don't know, but it can go either this way or this way, and obviously as a tour guide, not necessarily as a historian in any way, because I'm definitely not. But as a tour guide, you start, like for me, I would always sort of say, I would always give sort of both, but I would always ham up the more interesting one.
Yeah.
I would always, so it's like telling the story of Bruce and his spider. It probably didn't happen, but here's the most amazing story that you've ever heard.
Oh no, and it just sums them up. In actual fact, the spider story was first written down about James Douglas, not about Bruce.
I did kind of read something about that.
Yeah, it was
I remember once telling that story on a tour, and someone said, I heard the same story about Abraham Lincoln. And
really?
I was like, okay.
Well,
I don't know where. I don't think Abraham Lincoln would have ever been in a cave randomly.
It would be in a log cabin.
Yeah. But yeah. James Douglas, I've read, is it David R. Ross? I read his book, The Good, the Black Douglas, I think was the name of the book. It's sort of, it was,
he did his motorbike thing.
I don't think it was quite a big, thick book. Something tells me it was quite like almost like one, like almost like one that you would. I bought it at Bannockburn. I do remember buying it at Bannockburn, and that gives, certainly from what I've read so far, because obviously I haven't managed to get that far in your book yet. But just the killing of Henry de Bohun at Bannockburn gives one of the most incredible things. So when I used to take people to Bannockburn, I would always sort of tell that story. I would make my own sort of little version of it, but just the way in which that was told, I did like that. But I think James Douglas, as well, I suppose, kind of really gave us that Braveheart phrase, didn't he? From again, whether that was again, just written nonsensically or not, I don't know. But
well, there's an awful. I mean, Douglas was amazing. I mean, he was a bit of a thug, but that was really needed at the time. And of course, there's an awful lot of problems in terms of the history of what James Douglas did, because a lot of it was written at a time when his descendants were becoming really powerful as Earls of Douglas. And so you get, because Edward Bruce, for example, the king's brother, his line died out. So you can slag him off because there's nobody to get offended. Same with Thomas Randolph, the king's nephew. His line died out, so there's nobody at the court of Robert II and Robert III to go, all right, that's my ancestor, you're distant. So he doesn't feature as prominently in the Bruce, for example, as Douglas does. Despite the fact that Randolph almost certainly did more and was more important at the time. So you've got to be careful of that. And James Douglas at Bannockburn is particularly tricky because Barbara Bruce gives James Douglas command of one of the divisions. There's a Phantom 4th Division that Douglas and I think Walter Stewart supposedly had. They didn't. Walter Stewart, of course, is the progenitor of the Stuart dynasty. It's his son is Robert II, because he marries Marjorie Bruce. So they both, James Douglas and Walter Stewart, need to be put in centre stage as much as they can and bigged up. But we don't. It's taken us a while to unpick it again and go, actually no, they weren't. They were quite young. I mean, James Douglas is not knighted until Bannockburn. He doesn't do a hell of a lot before Bannockburn. And there's the famous instance supposedly that when Thomas Randolph is supposedly dealing with Clifford and Beaumont coming round the back of the Scots on the first day. That James Douglas is, you can almost imagine the king sort of holding his collar as Douglas tries to say, please let me go and help Randolph. No, you can't go and help him because it would be unchivalrous, because that's what Barbara does. Any opportunity to make what is not a chivalrous word look chivalrous, he takes it. But again, I mean, this, you've got to ask yourself: is this just trying to portray James Douglas in a good light, when in actual fact there's nothing in it? Which probably it is. But that doesn't mean. I mean, James Douglas is hugely important. I mean, he's given command. He basically is in charge in Scotland when a lot of the time when the king is away in Ireland, and Edward Bruce is away in Ireland. Thomas Randolph is quite often away, so he is very important. And I do have an affection for him and the king in their relationship, because there's this famous charter. I mean, Douglas got lands from Bruce, but they were kind of all brought together in 1323. Everything that the king had given him was put into this big charter, and it's called the Emerald Charter because the king also gave Douglas an emerald, which managed to lose. And there was clearly, a great bond between them. They, Douglas is much younger, but they've been through an awful lot together, and they obviously got on. And when Bruce's final years, when he had his manor house built at Cardross near Dumbarton, Douglas had his own room, and he got to furnish it as they liked, which I think was quite sweet. And the two of them were together as much as possible in the final year of Bruce's life. And I think that's the kind of thing I really like. It's those personal relationships. The fact that these were real people, Lord, amazing, and accepting them as that, not cardboard cutout black and white figures, who always did what was right. We had all that when I was young in the films that we saw, Ben-Hur and all, Spartacus, and totally, you knew who was right and you knew who was wrong. I think we've moved on from that, and for me, that psychological complexity is what I find fascinating.
Definitely. Now, it was interesting that you said that, because there was one other sort of question that popped out. There was one I was trying to get to sleep last night. One of them was like, obviously every story is meant to have a good guy and a bad guy and all that sort of thing. Was out of, like, looking at it from your perspective, who was the bad guy, who was the good guy out of, like, say, for example, Edward and Bruce? Like, because I always used to sort of say they were as bad as each other.
Yeah.
They did the same sort of thing, and I think.
Yeah.
But all of these movies always, and you know, or any, because it's for entertainment, there's always got to be a good guy. It's like Batman and the Joker, you know, there's a good guy and there's a bad guy. But when you tear it down, like Batman and the Joker, they're essentially the same guy. But in your mind, it's like, you know, good guy, bad guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of no, I agree. I mean, they're very similar. I mean, their characters are incredibly similar. And I mean, it's easy for us, isn't it? We can sit here 700 years on, and none of the implications of what either of them did affect us. I mean, you could say that, Scotland survived thanks to Bruce, although it was touch and go in the 1330s after he died. And that obviously had an impact on Scottish history subsequently. But I absolutely agree. I mean, how can you possibly say that Bruce is? I mean, it's always amazing to watch these films and see how they get round the murder of Common. And basically, that's what they do. They say, well, we've basically got to get over that before we get on to, you know, the real story. Whereas that is the pivotal moment. That is the deciding moment. And John Comyn is not just some guy who had a bad haircut or whatever. You know, he wasn't just some bad guy. You know, he was the leader of this guy. It's like somebody killing de Gaulle or something. You know, it's just like
Common's importance never sort of really. It's almost sort of like what we were saying about Andrew Murray and William Wallace. Like Andrew Murray's kind of quite unfairly forgotten for various reasons.
He died. And
but I mean, before that, like he was a major part of like Stirling Bridge, major part, and obviously then the lead up to that, and John Comyn as well. It's not really like especially in Outlaw King, it's very much a case of Bruce is a bit like, well, how are you going to do? It's just sort of like it's a bit part of the conversation. How are you going to deal with Comyn? And it's like, well, wait and see. Then it's like stab. And then that's it. Like there's no kind of real
relationship.
Like there's no kind of they don't show how quite an important part
they
of the whole
can't.
thing
But they can't, because if they did, you can't portray Bruce as good. That's the problem.
We need to stop that then.
Yeah, I know. We need to form a society that free John Comyn from ridiculous bad portrayals in films. I mean, really.
Just bad portrayals. It's like, who cares whether or not the person's a bad guy? You know what I mean? It's like show it for what it really is. You know, like
absolutely
take those common misconceptions and just be like, no, this is how it was.
Yeah.
You know, like Braveheart makes William Wallace out to be this amazing guy, and then it's like, well, no, he burnt down churches, he killed priests, he killed women, he killed children. You know, it's just that's how it went at the time.
It's how it went. Yeah, absolutely. You can't be squeaky clean in that kind of environment. You can't. I mean, you don't need guys who are, you don't need guys who are whiter than white. You need guys who are prepared to get stuck in. And it's just awful. It's absolutely awful. Yeah. And as I said right at the beginning, that's what I find so problematic about this period is, even though it's so important to Scottish history, less so to English history, it must be said, but it's because the relationship between the two countries had been so good beforehand. And then so quickly, and the minute you've done it, the minute the first atrocity and then second atrocity is done by one side and then the other, that's it. People don't forget, and you've got more to fight for because of what the others did to you, and you can see that across the world. You know, it does not take long. It's like our good reputation is lost in an instant, and gaining it again takes forever. It's the same with war. Once friends and neighbours turn on each other, it's really hard to go back. And that for me is the catastrophe. It's an utter catastrophe. And we can all get really gung-ho about Byrne and what have you, but let's be realistic about the tragedy of this war and the terrible things that happened to Scots, and at the hands of Bruce. At the hands of English armies, and the same Scots reciprocated. You know, I mean, and we're talking at a time of deteriorating climate. So harvests were failing in the midst of all of this. And a lot of the time, Wallace took his men over into the north of England to get food, because you didn't want your men to be going eating the food of your own folk, because that doesn't make you popular. And then the English retaliated, and they came into Scotland and took away stuff. The Irish hated the Scots as much as the English, because at a time of famine, they were eating up scarce resources, so these are the hard realities. And it might make us feel good to have won a battle, but I don't think many people felt all that good at the time. And the repercussions for Scotland, it's quite clear from the legislation in King Robert's Parliament that there was a huge amount of disorder in the country for the simple reason that every nobleman had his armed retinue, and they weren't always asking nicely for stuff. The rule of law almost certainly was less strong, because it was a time of war, and you needed these guys to be on side. So let's just have our eyes open. I mean, like you said, let's tell it like it was, and most of the time it was pretty awful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always said there's no such thing as a happy ending in Scottish history, whereas everybody thinks there's all these romantic tales and stuff.
They were no worse than anybody. I mean, that's another sort of thing I don't like, is when people go, "Oh, Scotland's history is so bloody and muddy and what have you." And which, if you watched your average BBC television series on Scottish history, that's how it comes off. No, it blooming isn't. It's Scottish history is the same as every other history. If you want to see people murdering each other and how many kings get killed, look at England.
Yeah.
They have civil war after civil war. We didn't tend to do that. I mean, we got better at it as the time went on. But in general, we steered away from civil war. So I don't like this kind of dissing down Scottish history as much darker and gloomier than anybody else's. It has its moments, but it's no worse than any other. And the Scottish nobility, we're no more fractious and argumentative than any other nation. Maybe we're just better at it, but we're not. As I say, just have a look at English history, and then have a look at French history, and any nation, they're all at it. There's differences every step of the way. No nation is homogenous and thinking and speaking with the same voice. Of course that's not true. And anybody who pretends that it is not in the real world, in my opinion. And it's the same with Scottish history. But we are no worse than anybody else. And we should stop dissing ourselves. We should stop doing that.
Oh, definitely.
Because it's not true. I mean, just look at the current situation. I don't want to make a political point, but the idea that Scots are actually incapable of dealing with certain crises isn't standing up. There are questions to be asked, but so there are questions to be asked south of the border, so it just depends on the narrative you want to spin. And we've been spun a narrative that says we're rubbish, and I don't think we need to believe it, which doesn't mean that we were the best thing since proverbial sliced bread either.
Yeah. No, I fully agree.
There we are. We've ended with we've actually gone right the way through with pretty much agreement, which is nice.
I think it's just I think I've learned a lot, but it's also been just fun.
Yeah, well, that's how it should be.
So folks, that's the end of episode number 38. Thank you very much for tuning in. Just if I could have your attention just for another couple of minutes. And of course, that's just to mention the social media thing. If you haven't already, head over to www.scotthistorypod.com. From there, you can find links to almost all of the places where you can hear this podcast. It will also have a link onto the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/ScottHistoryPod, the Twitter page @ScottHistoryPod, and instagram.com/ScottHistoryPod. And lastly, if you enjoy the podcast and you want to help support the podcast, you can do so via the Patreon page, patreon.com/ScottHistoryPod, and you can choose to donate anything between £1 and £3 per month to the podcast, which of course just helps out with the running costs. So once again, thank you very much for listening, folks, and I will speak to you again next week.